Welcome to the Stories in the Cemetery podcast, where we discuss investigations, paranormal methods, and equipment. We're more than just a podcast, and if you've been on one of our interactive ghost hunting experiences in downtown Charleston, well, you already knew that. We also run a Spirit Box boot camp, have recently published our first paranormal workbook, and are constantly challenging and experimenting with new paranormal methods and technologies. We even created a scoring system to determine how active a paranormal investigation is after you're done investigating. We call it the SITC scoring system. This podcast also has a blog post for each episode so that you, the listener, can see and interact with our investigations and studies into the paranormal. Let's get into today's episode and methodologies. Well, hey guys, welcome to episode 43. It's been a minute, but that's okay because this episode is definitely going to make up for a lot of what we've missed out on over the past few months to a year. I don't even know how long it's been, to be quite honest. But this episode will be on moon phases and our 110 investigation study on how the moon affects our paranormal activity. So, first, I think I need to get through some of the show notes for obviously the intro to this show, but know that we will be commercial free through this entire episode. And of course, that is the intention moving forward with all episodes. So, the show notes. There's a couple of things. First off, I always want to talk about our interactive ghost hunting experiences and kind of let you know what some of the updates are with that. We've added a new location since the last time you've probably been with us. I know most of the listeners here have been on, one of our experiences. I'm not going to call them tours. I would do my best to not call them tours. But there's been a couple of changes over the past few months. We have a new location this year. I always try to take out one location and add one new one. So that way, repeat ghost hunters on this experience do not have to go see the exact same spaces, even though the activity will be different on every single investigation because ghosts are not on the payroll. And if you've been on one of my, hosted expeditions of ghost hunting, you've heard me say that quite a bit. Every investigation is different. With the new location this year, we've kind of twisted it up a little bit, and we have added the Estes method to this last location on the route. So if you're unfamiliar with the Estes method, it is a sensory deprivation experiment that started off in Estes, Colorado, and we may even just do, here we go again with that I may even do, just one episode on the Estes method and our findings from it, because this is something that I'm going to have to add into our new workbook, and it does change the way that our investigations are scored. So I'm kind of getting ahead of myself here, but if you're interested in doing the Estes method and want to actually be in a haunted location while you're practicing with this a little bit more of an extreme ghost hunting method, by all means, come see us in Charleston, South Carolina. We'll be glad to blindfold you and throw some noise-canceling headphones your way while listening to a spirit box after learning how to listen to a spirit box for approximately 2 hours before we put you under. But it is a lot of fun. It is a 50-50 shot of actually getting activity out of it or not, just because we are super careful with how we approach going into the Estes method and prepping our ghost hunters, especially those that have never done this before or have listened to a spirit box prior to being on the experiences. But again, super fun. Love watching all of the reactions that we get out of this. And it has been, like I said, a 50-50 shot. But overall, I would say even on the sessions that are not as fruitful or productive, it is still super fun for all other guests to kind of watch how this goes down and the full explanation of how to approach the Estes method. We've added a few pieces of equipment to the interactive ghost hunting experiences and taken out a few that were not so exciting or so productive for us. We did take out laser grids. We are finding that lasers are not always the most productive piece when we're walking around the city. So what we've done instead is we've added an SLS camera and the very classic tri-field meter. So there's been A lot of speculation with the SLS camera and how they work and operate. And we would love to have you come try out ours. Like it works fantastic. And the tri-field meter, we're still learning more and more about the different types of EMF that it measures. So as that becomes more of a staple for our tours, we will actually be talking more about that. So I mentioned earlier about the scoring of our investigations, and I guess I need to, formally announce that Stories in a Cemetery has created a workbook that kind of displays how we go into scoring an investigation to see how active it actually was. It's a lot of fun to actually go through and actually see the end result and have tangible, measurable results to look at and compare to other investigations, especially when we're out doing the interactive ghost hunting experiences on a nightly basis. So we thought it was only fair that you actually get to see when once you're on the tour and you go through the whole gambit of the 2 to 2.5 hours with me, then I give you all of the data back, but you also have a score to kind of put it up against with a rating system to see how active your investigation was. And we felt like it was only fair to be able to do that. I don't know that anybody or any other company or paranormal investigator has ever done this. So I feel like we're kind of pioneering this and tweaking it to add in certain aspects of what the interactive experience is all about. And what we found is that I still have to make a few more tweaks when I release the 2024 edition, because as things change for us paranormal investigators, I'm going to have to change a few things inside the workbook. With that scoring system, we've actually added a name to it, and we made it hard to say on purpose. We want you to remember what this is and how it actually works. We call it the SITC scoring system. The SITC is the acronym for Stories in the Cemetery. And the scoring system just has that S sound at the beginning of every word. But again, we wanted you to remember it. We wanted it to be hard to say. And that way, when it does come down to who was the one who pioneered this, it's okay to mispronounce the SITC scoring system. I'm probably going to do it a few times myself. This scoring system has pretty much led to this podcast episode that we're about to discuss with the moon phases. As time progressed and I was gauging a lot more different aspects of the conditions of every investigation, I was keeping track of moon phases because I cannot tell you how many times I get asked, it's a full moon. Are we going to have more activity? Does the full moon, affect paranormal activity the way, they tell you about on TV? That's what we're going to dive into, and that's what we're really going to show you some of the charts and the spreadsheets that we've made and created to display and really take a deep dive into, does a full moon actually have more of an effect on paranormal activity than, say, a new moon, which is obviously the exact opposite. Here's also the, I guess, inspiration for this particular episode. I only went through the past 7 months worth of investigations. Stories in a Cemetery puts on an interactive experience 7 nights a week unless it's raining or it is a major holiday. We were able to take 110 investigations and put them against each other and separate them and sort them and see how they worked versus how many, full moons were there that were gauged and so forth and so on. And we're going to discuss, and this may be a lot of numbers and it may be very nerdy and techie for some of the paranormal investigators, but without these kind of tangible numbers, this episode wouldn't be possible to actually show you how does the moon affect our paranormal investigations. That is the full question at hand. Is it a full moon? Does it win? There's a lot that goes into this, and we have actually, after going through the study, at the end of this episode, we will have our predictions for the remaining 2023 year of which dates in every single month will probably be the most active. And we are not going to look at this list until after the year is over, because we do not want to be biased towards these specific dates to make sure, like, hey, we have heightened activity on this interactive experience. I'm definitely going to look at this come January to see how accurate my numbers were. Now, with that said, of course, I cannot prove any of that to you. but you're going to have to kind of take my word for it. And if it's lower, I'm going to do another moon phase episode, probably in January of next year, because if my predictions were true, we're going to continue to predict based on the findings from this particular study and continue to study it. So that way it remains accurate and gets even more accurate than what we're about to discuss today. I know that that was just a lot to cover for just our show notes, and I honestly have no idea how long this episode is going to be. There's a lot to cover. It may be an hour, it may be an hour and a half. I am honestly not sure how long this is going to be, but what I will tell you is that I have the utmost confidence in the data that I'm about to give to you from our 110 investigations of studying how the moon phase affects the paranormal activity around us. I say we get right into it. All right, guys. So let's really get into this whole moon effects on the paranormal piece here. I'm just bringing up some of my windows as I kind of get ready to tell you about some of how we started conducting this study and how it truly began. But I think we kind of really need to get the superstitions and some of that stuff out of the way. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. I'll be quite honest with you. If you want to learn about the superstitions of werewolves and the full moon in the back of every Halloween picture ever created, by all means, I'm sure there's other podcasts for that. But this one's really going to deep dive into, does the moon affect paranormal activity? And because there is so much information here, I'm going to kind of breeze through the fact that, that we're not going to discuss werewolves, but the only thing I will bring up is that the term lunacy has stemmed from the lunar cycles of the moon. So I think most of us already know that here, but it is kind of noteworthy to mention just because there are plenty of community service worker tales and even television shows about how things get a little crazy, so to speak, and I hate to use that term with lunacy, when there is a full moon. I mean, even dating back in history, I did read some accounts of where, certain doctors, psychiatric doctors would, lock up their patients a little bit more thoroughly during a full moon just to make sure nothing was going to occur. Again, there's a lot that goes around this, but that's the whole point of why I wanted to start this study to begin with, because I have the opportunity with doing paranormal investigations on a nightly basis to really, deep dive into this and kind of see if there is something to a full moon and paranormal activity. I think you're going to find all of the outcomes of how we broke this down very interesting for sure. And if you are a paranormal investigator, I invite you to really stick this podcast episode out to the end. Again, I have no idea how long this is going to be, but there are going to be predictions of the most active dates for every single month of the remaining 2023 year. Granted, I'm going to take a look at these again in January of 2024 and look at the dates from my investigations from the interactive ghost hunting experiences and kind of gauge them to see how accurate my predictions were. So I'm pretty excited about that, but I think we're going to just break right into some of the moon phase terms, so that way we're kind of all speaking the same language here. And of course, I'm always going to, especially with this particular episode, kind of push you off to read the blog post and kind of follow along. This is a full study, folks. Like, I may, recite it back to you while you're, driving in your car or, just listening with your earbuds. But to really see how the charts match up and the terms we're going to be discussing with definitions all over the blog post, this will make a whole lot more sense. I want you to really think of this as kind of a moon phase study lesson. And that's why this is probably going to go well over an hour, just due to the fact of there is a lot of data here to discuss with numbers. So going over the moon phase terms, I think we need to cover the phases first. There are 8 of them. A full moon, which is obviously the one for the focus of this study, is where the moon is 100% visible. A new moon, the exact opposite, is where we cannot see any of the moon's surface, so that is 0%. A waning moon is when a moon's surface visibility is getting smaller. So waxing is the exact opposite of that. So that's when a moon's surface visibility is getting larger to us here on Earth. A gibbous moon is a moon's surface visibility that is greater than 50%. So if we have a waxing gibbous moon, that means it's getting larger, closer to a full moon, and we can see more than 50% of the surface from Earth. A crescent moon, that one should be pretty easy for us. We all know the term crescent. That's when a moon's surface visibility is less than 50%. So gibbous is more than 50, crescent is less than 50. A first quarter moon is when a moon's visibility is exactly 50% after a new moon. I'll repeat that one again. A first quarter moon is when the moon's visibility is exactly 50% after a new moon. A last quarter is a moon's visibility is exactly 50% after a full moon. So there's your 8 terms. Obviously, crescent, gibbous are mixed with waning and waxing to determine exactly where we are. So there could be a waning gibbous, a waning crescent, a waxing gibbous, and a waxing crescent. So obviously the way the moon rotates, that's basically how it determines how much visibility we can see here from Earth. Of course, I left a chart on the blog post so that way you can actually see it in full effect instead of just listening to me talk about it. It makes more sense when you have visuals, especially when we're talking about moon phases, and it just makes things a whole lot easier. Later in the study, I'm going to mention, and I'm going to look up the pronunciation, so if I change the pronunciation later on, you'll know why, but we're going to discuss perigee and apogee portions of the moon. So in essence, a perigee moon is the point of orbit of the moon when it's closest to the Earth, and an apogee moon is the point of orbit when the moon is farthest from the Earth. I just wanted to bring those up because those will be talked about much later on, and when we kind of go through a little bit more of the nitty-gritty, diving into the details of the charts that we studied for this. For the full study, I also wanted to kind of put it into this portion of the show just so you kind of had an idea of how it was pieced together and what we were actually looking at. First, you need to understand, like, this is 110 investigations. So that is 7 months worth of Stories in the Cemetery's interactive ghost hunting experiences, and it turned out to be 110 investigations in grand total. The SITC scoring system, the ranges for this, this group of 110 investigations is going to be between 50, which is a low score, all the way up to 70, which is a well above average score. You can learn more about the SITC scoring system, from the blog post. I won't go into the details of that because it is relevant, but it's not relevant at this point. Temperatures range between 32 degrees and 76 degrees Fahrenheit, and weather conditions were also gauged as far as clear, mostly clear, partly cloudy, cloudy. Rain and wind were used as a secondary set of conditions. You kind of keep in mind that I don't go on the experiences if it is obviously raining for more than 15 to 30 minutes out of the tour consecutively. So that's just something maybe you might want to jot down in case you're ever visiting Charleston and you want to come out and see me. So averages from the study of all 110 investigations, the scores, the SITC scoring system scores are 35.67. That turns out to be an average. As far as on the scale of where it fits of below average, average, above average, very haunted, you can kind of see where that's going. The average temperature was 60.48 degrees Fahrenheit. And as far as the conditions go, 49% of those 110 investigations were clear, 7% were mostly clear, 19% were partly cloudy, and 25% of them were cloudy. This is a lot of data that I'm kind of throwing at you. And again, when you kind of look at this on the blog post, it almost really looks like a full scientific study. I know I have a lot of, writing education behind me. But when I started really looking at this, it really kind of goes into looking like a full scientific report. And that's why I'm urging you to definitely use the blog post to kind of follow along. Like I said, there's a ton of data here. And when you start analyzing it, and I'm going to be talking about those analyses, you're going to see like it can be a little overwhelming. So please follow the blog post, especially when you're listening with this, because there's going to be a lot that's going to be coming up at you as we kind of dive into how we started to break things down. With this portion, I'm going to go right into what the full 110 investigations look like when we threw it at, some analyses. I know I just gave you all the averages and things like that, but I wanted to break it down by how many moon phases of each of the 8 that I've already previously mentioned actually took place during these investigations. So I broke it down, and you'll see a colored chart once you go to the blog post and kind of check that out. But what I found interesting was I wanted to take the averages for these to kind of get us started on what's the most active moon phase. And that's really the purpose of this. So we're going to break it down by the averages, starting with the highest to lowest. So with this particular set, with all 110 investigations being looked at with averages, the last quarter moon, which had 2 investigations out of that, had an average score of 45.5. So that's our top score. It really doesn't give us a whole lot of full definition of that because there was only 2 investigations involved. And as you see, like when we get through the breakdown of things, how I kind of went through the top 50% of the 110 investigations, the top 25%, and then the top 10 scores for the investigation. And those will be separated into segments so it doesn't start overlapping each other. So last quarter moon, 2 investigations, 45.5 average score. The next one is going to be a new moon, which is where things start to get interesting. So we had 4 investigations out of that 110 were new moons with an average score of 40.3, so about 5 points less than the last quarter moon. The waning gibbous moon had 23 investigations with an average score of 38. And I find that interesting that is the top out of the waning and waxing between the 8 of all the waning and waxing moon phases. So 23 investigations with an average score of 38. A waning crescent was next. So we have the 2 wanings that are kind of leading the way out of those set of 4. Waning crescent moons had 25 investigations with an average score of 36.6. A waxing gibbous moon, which is obviously where it is bigger, and it is getting bigger and is more than 50%. 29 investigations, average score 34.5. A waxing crescent was trailing just behind with 20 investigations at a score of 34, so only half a point away from the waxing gibbous. A full moon, which had 5 investigations, and remember that only occurs once or twice per month. So there was 5 investigations from the interactive ghost hunting experiences that were full moons, average score of 32.6, and last was a first quarter moon with only 2 investigations, average score of 24. So I find it interesting that the full moon, first off, you need to know, is second from last out of the 8, as far as when you're looking at this as a whole. And really when you dive into this and you see where we can, kind of get some grit to this and a little bit of traction is where the waning gibbous moon starts to come into play. So far, to me, that looks like it's leading the way. But of course, as we move through this, it might change. It might stay the same. That's where things are going to get interesting for you as far as where does the full moon fall and what moon phase actually has the most activity. So, guys, I know that this is a lot of data and information, and this is how the whole episode is going to go. So the next segment, we're going to dive into the 50%, the top 50% of the top half of the scores. So the top 55 scores out of that 110 investigation study, and then we're going to analyze those and kind of see where things fall. I also find it very interesting because I broke it down even further than just, how many investigations were there and the average score. I kind of wanted to know, how many of these particular moon phases were studied out of the full 110 investigations. And I really kind of, I'm not going to go into that here on the podcast. I think I'm going to stick to the averages and kind of show you how this was broken down. If you want to see how many of these investigations had, and when I break it down into the top 50, for example, in the top 50%, 4% of them were full moons, but 40% of them came from the 110. So it's kind of an interesting piece on really how it breaks down I'm not going to nerd out too much on you in the next section. I'm going to go straight into the averages and kind of break it down, but you can definitely go into the blog post and see all of those charts. So, guys, this is a lot of info, and I can't wait till we really get into that top 10 to kind of show you how the patterns went, moving from the top 50 to the top 25 to the top 10. To the top 55 or the top 50%, top 25%, and then the actual top 10 out of the 110 total investigations to show you how this is going to go. And then we're going to talk about that perigee and apogee, where the moon's orbit starts to come into play, and how we started scratching our heads a little bit of how this is actually breaking down and what actually makes sense. So if you're a paranormal investigator, thanks for nerding out with me. First off, this is going to get very geeky very quickly. So with that said, let's stop this segment, and I'm going to start the next segment here in just a second. All right, so let's get into the top half of the most active investigations out of the 110 investigation study. So this is where things are going to start really, getting into the details of why we did what we did. And this is where we're going to start discussing the perigee and apogee as well. But again, I'm not going to get into how many were studied and how many crescents and so forth and so on. I'm going to go straight into the averages based on the top 50% of the 110 investigations to see where we can start breaking some things down. So we're going to start off with the new moon phase. We had 2 investigations with an average score of 48. That was our top contender. But again, with only 2 investigations in there, it's a little hard to kind of say like, hey, this was enough to study from. So I think when I do the episode in January of 2024, I'm really going to look at January through December. So that way I can have a whole full 12 months. And of course, there's going to be a lot more investigations to kind of analyze and, put into charts and things like that. But I think it'll be well worth it to really see, because I'd like to have more than just 2 new moons in there or 2 full moons and so forth and so on. The next contender was waning crescents. There was 12 investigations in that top half, average score of 47.9. So that's only 0.1 away from the new moon average score of 48. So that's I guess pushing on to be a pretty good contender for when the most activity actually occurs. Waning gibbous, another, obviously the next waning phase of the moon. We had 12 investigations, 47.5, so still pretty close to that 48, which is what the new moon score was at the top. Last quarter moon falls into the next spot, that it had 2 investigations at 45.5 points. A full moon, 2 investigations, 43 points. So we are 4 phases away from the bottom. So it fell like right into the middle when you put it into how many the average score for the amount of investigations that were there, which was a grand total of 55, and there was only 2 full moons in there with an average score of 43. Waxing crescent comes in next, 11 investigations, average score of 42.2, and then a waxing gibbous, 14 investigations, average score of 41.3. First quarter moon, there were no investigations involved in the top half, so I can honestly say it's probably pretty good to say, or pretty safe to say that, it's not a contender at this point, that a first quarter moon is going to be any kind of heightened paranormal activity for us. So the perigee and apogee, I started diving into this just because I wanted to see where the orbits kind of fell into play, because once I started getting into the top 25 and the top 10, nothing was really like perfectly lining up, or we could say like, hey, the new moon and waning crescent are the top ones every single time. So I wanted to kind of see what else are we missing here? What's the next piece? So perigee, remember, is when the orbit of the moon is closest to the Earth, and then the apogee is when it is farthest from the Earth. So what I wanted to do was I wanted to take, there are charts that you can find online, which was beautiful, by the way. It gave us the exact dates of when the moon was closest and furthest away from us. And what I did was I kind of took a 3-day span, and I wanted to kind of put those closest and farthest on the charts to kind of see within 3 days. So obviously the moon's not going to get from the furthest away from us to the closest, more than, a good 3 to 7 day period. So I figured 3 days was pretty safe. What I found through this whole portion, and we're still on the top half of the 110 investigations, so 55 investigations. I measured the scores and then the number of investigations and then the average score. I thought that would give us a pretty good outlook on, does the perigee or apogee make a difference on how we should be looking at this? So looking at perigee first, closest to the Earth, the score total was 535 of those particular investigations. There was 11 of them, which gave an average score of 48.63. So that kind of falls right in line with the top score for just the moon phase of new moon and waning crescent at 48 and 47.9. So when it's closest to the Earth, the average score was 48.63. When it was farthest from the Earth, the apogee orbit of the moon, the score was 243 with only 6 investigations. So almost, just above half of how many of the investigations there were for when it was closest. So there was 11 when it was closest, only 6 when it was farthest. But the average score for furthest away was 40.5. That's over 8 points of the difference. Like, that's a pretty big gap. I will also say that 40.5 falls below the lowest score of the moon phases for their averages, which was 41.3. So I find this all perfectly fascinating. And again, I hate to say keep going back to the blog so you can follow along, but at this point, you should probably see why. Me throwing numbers at you and telling you, what I'm reading in front of me, this is kind of like a follow along where it's a lecture class, so to speak, on very nerdy, geeky. We're going to study moon phases and see if the full moon is, truly, part of our myths and legends, and if it actually has any, any girth to it. So again, so far, a new moon and waning crescent are the top 2 moon phases for the top half of the number of investigations that were there. And I would say that the proximity, the perigee orbit of the moon, is definitely taking over for having way more activity than when the moon is farthest away from us. So again, so far, I hope I've piqued your interest in keeping track and keeping up with me at this point. But in the next section, we're actually going to move on directly into the top 25%. So again, I'm not going to give you all the details of the percentage of how many moon phases from the original 110 were put in there. We're going to cover just the averages and then the perigee and apogee portion of this, so that way you can kind of keep up with how I'm starting to look at this, and does the full moon have a full effect on our investigations. So hang in there, guys. We're getting through this. This is actually working out really well. I'm glad that it's not turning into a 30-minute session per section. I was kind of worried about that. So hang in there. We're going to start going over the top 25% next. Okay, guys, so it is time to start getting into the top 25% of the 110 investigation study that was done for, obviously this episode and the blog and the full report that you'll be able to see all of the charts. So we've gotten through quite a bit of the mess, obviously talking about the conditions at first, and then going through the top 50%, where there was 55 investigations that were analyzed against each other, and we're breaking it down next for the top 25%. That's a total of 27 investigations that were, kind of pressed against each other. I'm not going to go into all of the details of the, which moon phases studied out of the full 110 came into this list. I'm just going to get right down into the nitty gritty with this, because there's a lot of numbers coming at you and things like that, but I want to just get right into what were the top average scores. And the top 2 contenders are the same as they were for the top 50%. So if you recall, the new moon was in first place for the top 50%. It's the same thing for the top 25%. However, there was only one investigation. Obviously, that score was 57. So that is our top winner for the top 25%. Second place, same thing again with the waning crescent moon. There were 7 investigations, which was the second highest amount of investigations per moon phase, and that had an average score of 55.1. So that's just under 2 points below the new moon phase, and we only lost 5 of the waning crescent investigations that didn't make it to the top 25%. Next after that, in third place, we have the last quarter moon phase. That actually had 1 investigation that fell into this category, the top 25%, with a score of 55. So literally just 0.1 as far as the score goes, underneath a waning crescent moon. So they're about tied. But again, with the lack of data, with only having 1 investigation that falls into this, I kind of have to wonder how legitimate is that number. Of course, once we do the full year study, we're really hoping to see these numbers jump up. Next in line is full moon, right in the middle of the pack again. Only 1 full moon investigation made it into the top 25% with a score of 51. Next is a waning gibbous. 9 investigations. It had the most, but the average score for that fell pretty low in the totem. That was 50.2. Waxing gibbous was next with 4 investigations, 49.5 average score, and then a waxing crescent. So that's 4 investigations with an average of 49, and the first quarter moon did not make it into this list, the same as it didn't for the top 50%. So you could see where things are starting to shift a little bit, but it looks like still, if I were to put, really my finger on which one of these moon phases is kind of in the lead right now as far as which causes or is the most occurring with the highest paranormal activity, the waning crescent is really holding some ground here, even though it has, only the second highest number of investigations that were placed into the top 25%, only because a new moon only had 1 investigation. So it's almost as if we can eliminate it, especially since there's no average for us to, kind of take a look at and go into the details of it. So, I'm going to definitely look at the next in line for waning crescent as being, one of the most active moon phases when I'm going through these investigations. So a waning crescent, if you recall, a waning is when the moon is getting closer to a new moon where we're not, obviously getting closer to 0% of a new moon. So it's 49 to, 1%. Is the percentage of the moon that we'll be able to see, and it's getting smaller. So it's going to be that crescent. So obviously, it's kind of leading the pack here, and it's going to be very interesting once we start talking about all of these perigee and apogees. So I'm going to jump into that next for this specific set of data that came through with the top 25% of the investigations. Remember that the perigee is when the moon is closest to the Earth, and then the apogee is when it is farthest from the Earth. So starting with the closest, because again, it won, just like it did in the top 50%. The score there was 424 with 8 investigations, and the average score for that is going to be 53. So that is, obviously the top out of the 2 yet again. And then when we're looking at the apogee orbit of the moon, the score was 90. That's not very many because only 2 investigations made it into the top 25% when the moon was farthest away from the Earth with an average score of 45. So it's 8 points away from when, the perigee orbit of the moon, obviously the closest. But again, I still have to look at the number of investigations that were even included. And, going back, just taking a quick step back when we're talking about the orbit and the closest and furthest away from the Earth, just to recap, the top 50%, there was 11 investigations where it was closest and 6 when it was farthest. So, just over half of, the amount of investigations is where the furthest fell away, was in that bracket there. But now, looking at the top 25%, we only have a quarter of the number of investigations where that fell into the top 25%. So 2 versus 8, that's a pretty big difference. Again, I know a lot of throwing numbers at you, and I'm hoping you are looking at the blog post at this point because we're getting down to it to find out which moon phase actually creates or is the most occurring with the most amount of paranormal activity. So we're going to, obviously take a quick segment break. So I'm just going to play that little jingle in between, and then we're going to get into the top 10 investigations. So that way we can really narrow this down and come up with our, hypothesis of which moon phase actually is going to be the winner of this. So hang in there, guys. We're getting through this. Like I said, I know I keep saying that. I know this can be rough with all these numbers. So keep following along with me, and let's continue on to the top 10. All right, guys, we made it. We're here, the top 10. And it's going to kind of be a huge surprise, and I'm sure you can already see where this is going. Of course, the color chart is on the blog, so hopefully you're following along, and let's get into it. So, does a full moon actually create the most amount of paranormal activity? Not one full moon investigation out of the total amount of full moons for the 110 total made it into this list. So, first off, we have our answer, debunked. I hate to be the bearer of bad news and, debunking an old legend this way, but let's get into it. So, a waning crescent, number of investigations, 3 made it into the top 10. So, 33% made it in there. Average score of 66. Number 1, waxing crescent. So that would be a crescent moon that's getting bigger, closer to a full moon. 1 investigation made it in with an average score, obviously, of only 1 in there, is 62. A new moon, where we can't even see the moon at all, beat a full moon in the top 10. There was 1 investigation that made it in there. Score was 57. Last quarter moon, 1 investigation made it in with a score of 55. A waning gibbous moon. So obviously it is getting smaller, but it is greater than 51%. So that's a 51 to 99% moon. 2 investigations made it in, average score of 51.5, and a waxing gibbous, exact same numbers. So it is a tie for last place on a waning gibbous and a waxing gibbous. So very interesting there, because they're on kind of opposite ends of the spectrum. I know they sound the same, but they are opposites. So this is a very interesting study, and I kind of saw this coming when I was going through all of this and seeing that the waning crescent moon was when we were seeing the most paranormal activity. I find this fascinating, and I hope you're doing the exact same thing too. Again, I wanted with these last 2 segments really just get into like what are we looking at here instead of all of the details and making this more confusing than it actually has to be. But what I will tell you is that I spent a lot of time analyzing all of this data. So let's take a look at the proximity of the moon in its orbit. Remember, when the moon is close, that's the perigee. We had a score of 191 grand total with 3 investigations in that. Average score was 63.67. Not one orbit, the apogee, where it was furthest away from the Earth, made it into the top 10. So I think with all of these studies and breaking it down and breaking it down and breaking it down once more, we can actually have some kind of tangible evidence of when we can expect the most amount of activity. So it is very clear, based on the 3 different studies and the proximity of the moon to the Earth, that has a little bit more effect than the moon phase itself. Now, this is, of course, my hypothesis. I'm begging you guys to argue with me. I would love to agree with me, but at the same token, I don't know that anybody is looking at these moon phases and looking at, does a full moon truly affect paranormal activity? I cannot wait to see how a full year of investigations, and I'll be curious to see what that number is actually, of how many investigations that'll be. You have to remember, with the interactive ghost hunting experience, I am open for that 7 nights a week. But that doesn't mean that I'm literally out, 30 to 31 days out of the year or out of the month, doing investigations. If it rains, the weather gets cold, nobody's booking or purchasing tickets to go ghost hunting. Every once in a while they will, I'll bundle up and we'll go. But at the same token, it's not going to be 365 full investigations. I'll probably put a number on this, and I'll guess it'll be between 200 to 225. So that's going to be a lot more investigations, over double, for this particular study. But as of right now, I'm going to literally put my finger on and bet that as we get closer to a much bigger study on this, I feel like we have an excellent start. Like, I'm not going to say like this is solid ground and this is the way it's going to be. We're going to continue to look at this, and hopefully you're going to be part of it and you're going to help us out. And you're going to, take a look at the new workbook that Stories in a Cemetery created with all of the scoring systems, so that way you can start scoring your own investigations. We'll talk more about that, towards the end of this episode. But I'm super excited. I hate to say, like, I get excited when I can debunk something and come up with an actual theory that makes sense. But I feel like that's something, my out of the box thinking that I normally do, even during the investigations with, the new friends that I make on every single investigation of people that come to see me. So it's always quick thinking on your feet. How do things connect? We have obviously a great opportunity to use all of these tours to, and again, call them tours, these experiences to really put them together and pit them against each other to see some of the attributes and the conditions of weather, the environment, the tools being used against each other, which ones work best with others, that we can really start to study this. And I feel like with this, studying the moon phases and kind of debunking an old myth, this is an awesome start. I'm super excited about it. I'm so glad that you made it this far into the episode. However, we're not done, because with all of this data, I had to make some predictions on when, the moon is going to be closest to the Earth, in line with a waning crescent moon of when I believe, and my predictions of when the most active nights are going to be for not only just my investigations here in Charleston, South Carolina, but for you. And I hope this helps. So I'm going to obviously put that little segment in the middle, and then we're going to talk about these predictions and see how they're going to line up and how I actually came up with them. Predictions. Am I a psychic? No, I am not a psychic. You all know that. What I will tell you is that I used all of the data from this 110 paranormal investigation study to piece together how I feel these are going to line up as far as going through and finding the most active evenings for your investigations. With this list, please take in mind that I am not going to keep peeking at this list to see if a specific date is coming up to make sure and fabricate anything. If anything, if you've been on one of these ghost hunting experiences with me, I debunk a lot of things. Folks like to stretch it. Folks like to really try to make things happen, and that's just not the way a paranormal investigation works. So if you're an investigator, I want you to really perk your ears up and grab a pen and paper, because I am going to give you the exact dates of when I feel, based on this study, when the most active nights are going to be. Because this is going to be published at the beginning of July, I'm going to eliminate the first date that I had. I've been working on this literally for months. So the first date on here is going to be July 10th, 2023. In August, it will be the 9th. September 13th, October 13th, November 12th, and December 9 and 10 are going to be the most active investigations based on the orbit of the moon, along with an alignment with the waning crescent moon. These are guesstimates. These are not predictions to the point of how I feel like a psychic would be accurate with helping us with things in our lives. These are a first true guesstimate of how we can start to narrow down when the most active nights will be and how we can start planning our work to find paranormal evidence. I'm going to go through these dates one more time, just in case you missed them. I'll read them off quickly, and then we will wrap up this very long episode of me going solo, talking numbers, charts, orbit, perigees, and apogees. Like this has been kind of a crazy study. If you can't tell, guys, I'm super excited about this. All right, the dates, one more time. July 10th, 2023. August 9th, 2023. September 13th, October 13th, November 12th, December 9 and 10. So those are my predictions. I'll be coming back to that in January. Of course, I'll probably start studying it in like late November, early December to start going through this. But at the same time, you're going to have to take my word for it. And if I'm wrong, I'm going to be the first one to admit it. If these dates are way off, based on the activity that comes out of my nightly investigations, I'll be the first one to admit it. I'm okay with that. I want to be wrong almost. If I am wrong, it just means I got to study a little bit harder, and I need to figure this out so we can come up with better predictions and closer predictions of how this is actually going to work. So I hope you found this episode as fascinating as it was for me to study it. Like, this was a blast. I used a ton of references to piece all this together, and using some of the graphics and learning about the perigee and apogee. Again, I still haven't looked up the pronunciation, so if I'm wrong, you guys can go ahead and correct me on social media. I'm perfectly fine with that. So a couple of things that I will wrap up with. Speaking of social media, I did start a Stories in a Cemetery TikTok channel or TikTok account, so you can actually see some of the crazy creations that I'm basically making announcements of things that we're doing with the ghost hunting experiences, because we're changing it up. We've added, just in the past week or so, the GhostTube VR Seer app along with the Estes method. So check out the videos on TikTok. They're a lot of fun for me to make. Obviously, they're promotional pieces, and they're kind of like me announcing like what we're doing and some of the equipment that we'll use or we're changing up, or maybe even some evidence might be coming up on some of those TikToks. Who knows? It's a blast for me to create them. I'm a creative person, as you guys already know, which means I'm a writer. I just love creating things, and you're gonna see my crazy color charts when you go through the blog post for this particular episode. The other piece, if you wanted to check out the workbook, if you're a paranormal investigator, the workbook like literally gives you a step-by-step of how to use our SITC scoring system to your own investigations. There's obviously a lot of math involved with adding things up and multipliers and how long was your investigation, because it is based on how long did you investigate and what did you find within that time frame. So there are multipliers in there. I will tell you that I sent a copy of this workbook to Mr. Sam and Mr. Colby. For those of you that are fans of them, I actually have a picture of the that was left to me from Amazon of their front porch. And of course, I had to send it over to, my daughter. She was super stoked to, see that picture. But anyway, they haven't responded. Hopefully they will one day after they go through it. It seems like they do a lot of traveling, especially overseas. So maybe they haven't even gotten it yet. But anyway, who knows? You might find it on Sam and Colby one day. But not looking for all the fame and fortune. I'm looking for all of the, let's get some real answers and stop making this just a horrified television show where people get super excited about what could be scary. Finding, this actual evidence on the ghost hunting experiences that I do nightly, it's not always a scary thing. It's definitely not a scary thing for me just because I'm hitting the same places on a nightly basis. I do have to go off course, off beat every once in a while because something might be giving me evidence to, basically give another piece of history to another nearby location. We're just getting a little bit of bleed over. And that's super fun because I have to stay on my toes and remember why it's connected to that specific location and so forth and so on. But I'm getting off track. Getting back to the workbook, you can go to Amazon and just type in Paranormal Investigation Workbook, and it should be the first thing that pops up, but it is a green cover. I'm sure you guys are familiar with the green that I use for Stories in a Cemetery's logo. It's a little bit darker than that, but every year when I update it, I will change the color of it, and of course it says 2023 edition on there. The cool thing is I know not everybody is doing as many investigations as I am doing with Stories in a Cemetery, but I did put enough worksheets in there for a full 12 investigations. I figure most paranormal teams are, doing, one investigation per month as they get their, connections set up and things worked out to where you can actually spend the night or, do a lockdown or whatever your method and process is. But I figured about one a month. So there's enough in there for 12 investigations. And of course, you can send your worksheets into us and with your team's logo, and we can post it on our website so everybody else can study what you found too. And of course, any evidence that you have with that, with audio pieces and video, we'll post it up there. Right there on storiesinthecemetery.com. Give credit to your team, links to your website. It's not that we're going to be taking your worksheets and saying this is what we've done. No, this is about what you've done, and that's part of the reason why I created that workbook. I wanted to help out other teams instead of let's just go and capture an EVP and be satisfied for the night. Yep, it's not enough. We need to get the score and kind of see how active the place was as a whole, if it was active at all. So that's the whole point behind the workbook. I hope you get excited about that as much as I am. I did a couple of tweaks to it. And of course, it's going to change year after year. Like there's going to be things added to it, maybe some more tips and tricks as new equipment comes available. Of course, I'll add things in there about the new equipment that's in there and what's available to us. But guys, getting back to the moon phase, super excited that I was able to debunk something based on legitimate sets of data where it wasn't biased one way or the other. This is the data from the past 7 months, and let's see what we can get out of this. So based on this study, again, the waning crescent moon is the winner when it is in perigee orbit, closest to the Earth, which to me makes complete sense. So again, love to hear your arguments. You can always follow us on Facebook. That's basically where I do a lot of my social media, but I'm having a lot of fun with TikTok. I was actually surprised about how much fun I'm having with TikTok. But anyway, head over to storiesinthecemetery.com. You can find the blog post link. That'll be the first link in the show notes for this audio. So that way you can follow along while you're listening, or you can read it after you've listened to this while you're driving home from work. But at the same time, guys, this has been a blast. I'm so excited that I was finally able to get this out to you, and I cannot wait to hear what your thoughts are on this. Waning crescent moons when perigee in orbit. And that's a wrap, guys. Thanks. I'll talk to you next time.